My job here tonight, I think, is really easy compared to a lot of other people who've talked, because we recognize names like Laurier and MacDonald, and recognize them as great prime ministers. But I think Pierre Trudeau is right up there, and most of us have lived through him being in power, and so that makes it even more engaging. I guess the problem, though, might be that it's kind of hard to get critical perspective on him, even though he has now, been a third of a century out of power. The phrase that was used by his biographers, his first biographers, was "he haunts us still." And you might have thought that he wasn't haunting us too much anymore, but then Justin came along. So, in facing this predicament of how to get critical distance on Trudeau, I thought that I'd offer you a kind of a cafeteria-style set of options on how to make sense of Pierre Trudeau. And so I came up with the idea of telling you 3 different stories about Pierre Trudeau. And that leads me to the title of my lecture. I think that, I don't know how familiar you all are with Trudeau's background, so I'll just give you a quick potted history of it, maybe as a reminder. He grew up in Montreal. His father was French-Canadian. His mother was English-Canadian with some French-Canadian background. And his father, who was a lawyer, became quite wealthy probably when Pierre was a young child by selling a series of service stations and a kind of rudimentary local CAA to a petroleum company. And so he had a kind of a privileged upbringing in Outremont and went to classical college, Brébeuf. And this was at a time when, by the time he got into his teenage years, he was born in 1919, there was a tendency amongst the good Catholic circles in which he found his intellectual formation to be very sympathetic to autocratic Catholic dictators in Europe who were fighting godless communism. And so there were flirtations at that time with that kind of French-Canadian nationalism. And also, when he was a teenager, he was involved in anti-conscription, political agitation. But then he went off to Harvard. He did a degree at the Université de Montréal, and then he went off to Harvard, and then he discovered liberal democracy and Keynesian economics, and he was converted to the kind of liberal democratic principles that he would hold to for the rest of his political career. He went off after that to study in Paris and then London School of Economics, and so he goes and wanders the world for a while with a backpack, and then returns to Quebec and gets engaged in the agitation against the what's perceived as the autocratic Duplessis regime in the 1950s, and in fact becomes a leading light in it, and one of the editorial board of Cité Libre, which was considered to be the intellectual center of opposition to Duplessis. And so by the early 1960s, he's seen as one of the fathers of the Quiet Revolution of the early 1960s in Quebec. Am I forgetting anything salient here? I think I got another slide that shows him as a young man. So then, it's after the Quiet Revolution, you have sort of 2 streams parting in that group that opposed Duplessis, and one is the poster boy for it is René Lévesque, and the other is Pierre Trudeau, and the René Lévesque school is neo-nationalist, and they want to use the emerging modern Quebec state as sort of the nucleus of Quebecois nation. And Trudeau sees this as nationalism rearing its ugly head again and decides that he has to do something about it. Although he'd been, associated extensively with the left, with the CCF, he decides that the way to deal with French Canadian nationalism, neo-nationalism in the 60s, is to join the Liberal Party and go to Ottawa, which he does in I guess it's the 1965 election. Lester Pearson is having problems with some of his French Canadian ministers getting into trouble, so he needs to replenish the ranks, the French Canadian representation in cabinet, and he recruits Jean Marchand, who is a very prominent Labour leader in Quebec. And Marchand says the deal is that if I come, my friends come with me, and so Gérard Pelchet and Pierre Trudeau go along for the ride. And how am I doing in terms of this potted history? The next thing is that he has a very rapid rise in the Liberal government. He's parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, and within a year or so, and then in the spring of 1967, he's appointed Justice Minister. So that is an incredibly quick rise to the top. But he's there because he fulfills a critical role in the Pearson government. So now I'm going to pause and make a few remarks about his personality, which you probably have opinions about as well. I see him as an introvert with ambitions that required him to be an extrovert. A private person who nevertheless wanted to be a great man of public affairs. And this isn't just naked ambition. His Catholic upbringing instilled in him a sense of duty, an ethic of public service, as well as a sense of obligation that, if you're privileged, you should be giving back. So as a kind of naturally shy introvert, he developed, I think, a protective kind of exoskeleton, a public persona through which he performed the part of a statesman. Part of that performance that we all might remember is that kind of tough guy act that he would do in the public sphere. Anyways, he was in a way, the faith of his youth was not replaced by, so I'm talking about his Catholicism and nationalism. They weren't replaced so much by skepticism and uncertainty, and as I'll later emphasize, an appreciation of contradiction and ambiguity. But my new faiths that nationalism was retrograde and that liberalism and rationality were the keys to progress. But the altruism of religion also lived on in the way that he positioned himself as a disinterested voice of reason in a political scene that would have been caricatured by him as being marked by hysteria and cupidity. He was also lucky because his timing was great. His timing in going to Ottawa was good, and within a few years, he was at center stage in national affairs as Minister of Justice. And there's a number of things going on at this point. And so it's here that I'm going to start my first tale of Pierre. If you can give me the next slide. That he is really the father of modern Canada, that Canada that was reborn or born again. Oh, hi, Grace. in the 1960s. So what's going on when he is Minister of Justice? Give me the next slide. Throughout the post-war period, English Canada was sloughing off its British inheritance and looking for a new autonomous identity in the world. And this is a wonderful McPherson editorial cartoon of Mike Pearson ushering Britannia into the manhole, which I think really captures that well. Canada's potential seemed huge, and nationalists were really excited about its prospects. And they used the metaphor often that Canada was coming of age, and they really felt this was true, that it was becoming a mature, independent adult nation among other adult nations. So this nationalism that had been building throughout the post-war period, it got some really tangible sense to it in 1967 with the Centennial and with Expo 67, which, if you come to the lecture on Friday, you'll learn more about. Can you have another slide, please? So, it's also the 1960s, the rise of the counterculture, protests against the Vietnam War, and the spirit of the times was to embrace change, throw off the oppressive yoke of tradition, achieve liberation from outmoded values and hypocrisies. And Canada was coming of age as the baby boomers were coming of age, and the 60s were peaking. So it seemed that fusty old British Canada was in need of updating to keep in step with the times. And there's another slide I wanted to show here. The political scene was considered to be quite desultory in the 1960s, with scandals and nothing really being achieved, despite the promise of Diefenbaker, and then again despite the new frontiersman promise of Pearson. And instead you've got all this mudslinging in Parliament, and the sense that things were just that federal politics were just spinning their wheels and they weren't getting anywhere. So there's almost an incipient sense of transformation in Canadian public affairs at this time, that something has to happen, and it has to happen soon. And then you've got all this collective joy of the experience of the Centennial and Expo 67, and the world admiring Canada's accomplishments. And so the question really becomes, how do you institutionalize this high? How do you keep it going? And in December of 1967, Lester Pearson resigns. And there's a leadership contest, a Liberal leadership contest. And the regular suspects line up for the leadership, but people are already thinking that they need, a new kind of leader to represent the new Canada. Can you have another slide? And the other thing that's happening right at this period is that the whole Quebec issue, which has been on the boil for the early part of the 60s, is really starting to heat up. This is, Maclean's in December 1967. The threat of separatism seems to be really a real and present danger in the fall of 1967. It's in the headlines constantly. And so, all this hope about Canada is at the same time undercut by fears about national unity, about what's going to happen with Quebec. And so Canadians are kind of, the Canadian nationalists anyways, are kind of being whipsawed by hope and fear. It's a highly emotional time. And then, the next slide, please. Does anybody know where this is and what this man is saying? Yeah.
Yeah, that's Tim Rafe in the foreground.
Oh, on the left?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
he's the same guy who did the Just Watch Me interview, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what I thought it was going to be. Just watch me.
Oh, no, you're wrong. Yeah.
Is it the sex in the bedrooms of the nation?
It's not sex in the bedrooms of the nation, although I'm sure there is that. No. Phyllis was right on the trail. It's somebody has to know this.
The government has no place.
The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. Yeah. So, this is in December of 1967. Trudeau he's first of all in the spotlight for the legislation liberalizing divorce, and then liberalization of decriminalization of homosexuality and abortion with the modifications to the criminal code in the fall. So that seems to be totally in step with the times, and so it's not. On top of that, of course, he's this rich bachelor with a jet-set lifestyle, right? So he seems to be really emblematic of the age, and so he's checking off all these boxes. He might not, have been what people were expecting to find, but when he appears in the spotlight, he suddenly looks like a solution to that leadership problem. Can you give another slide, please? And he's also, he's also very good on TV. He's getting a lot of publicity on national TV in the fall of 1967 from from the omnibus bill and from the divorce bill, and he is getting a lot more time on, the national news than any politician would ever get today. He has 2 or 3 minute interviews in prime time, and so suddenly he's, people are becoming conscious of him as a possibility. And well, what happens next is Trudeau mania ensues. By the way, this is an excellent book, which if you have any names on your Christmas shopping list that have not yet been ticked off, they would really, I think of you highly if you gifted them with such an erudite present. So, Trudeau came across well on TV, and the rest is history. You know what happened. He became leader of the Liberal Party after the Liberal leadership race through the winter. That convention was in April, and then won a majority government. Called an election right away, won a majority government in June. So, I see this nationalist moment in the 60s as being a kind of trifecta of Confederation, Expo, and then Trudeau mania. And so this interpretation of him being the father of modern Canada is like he's right there at the founding. He's instrumental to that. Can you give me the next slide, John? Thanks. And the idea here is that he is, that emotional whipsawing that I was talking about, and he's the perfect solution to the national unity crisis at the same time as he is seeming to answer all of the desires for a transformation in Canada. So he's going to move the nation ahead, and he's going to keep it whole while he does that. That's the inherent promise of his rapid rise to leadership. So what he's offering too in terms of the national unity crisis is not just a tough guy opposition to separatism. He's offering an alternative, like a positive alternative for French Canadians to be able to have a role of equality in Canada, and he's got a twofold plan for that. It's official bilingualism and Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that's right there from the start in 1968. And I like to think that English Canadians were presented with the Official Languages Act, and in their minds it was like a biblical parable in which they were being told to take their children and make them bilingual in order to save the country. So it's not quite Abraham and Isaac, but the sense of betrayal that came in the 1980s when Meech Lake seemed to be imminently implemented was, I think, due to the fact that a lot of English Canadians, particularly those who were invested in national politics, people who are middle class, and cared for the nation, and more liberal in their sympathies, willing to find an accommodation for French Canada. They did that. They sent their kids to French immersion, and it was a huge sacrifice. It changed their children's lives. And then how could you come along 20 years later and say, oh well, none of that matters. We're going to change the rules. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The next big step, if we have the next slide, is multiculturalism, which is a policy that Trudeau announces in 71. The problem was, throughout the 60s there was a lot of talk about two founding nations and a two nations solution to the constitutional issues. But during the B&B Commission in the 60s, a lot of Canadians sort of stuck up their hands and said, well, I don't identify as either English or French, and that led to an abandonment of the biculturalism part of the B&B Commission and the policy of multiculturalism. But Trudeau, even in, earlier in the 60s, you can see him extolling the virtues of pluralism and saying that Canada can be a model to the rest of the world in an era of increasing global migration for, how a nation can redefine itself in non-traditional nationalist terms and become a model for harmonious coexistence of different ethnic groups. And the one thing that's interesting about that, that's sort of a theme with Trudeau, is that nationalism isn't just about homogenous identities. It's also about being a nation amongst a community of nations. And so your status among other nations is just as important as identity. And Trudeau himself, won all kinds of international acclaim, just like Expo 67 did. People said he's our permanent Expo. And so this idea of Canada as a tolerant multicultural nation did the same thing. And so it was a kind of a offsetting, or what's the right word? It was, it compensated for losing an ethnic, British nationalism. You got instead a lot of external validation. The next essential part of Trudeau's term as Prime Minister, if you could put next slide, please, is that separatism in Quebec ended up being a real and present threat throughout the 1970s. And he was really the essential Canadian politician to combat separatism. There was talk in the 1960s about how really you needed an English Canadian to offer Quebec a deal because it wouldn't seem to be, insider trading. But the problem with that was that, well, I guess the advantage that Trudeau had was that he was French Canadian, and he was, as a French Canadian and a proud French Canadian, he was attacking or disparaging French Canadian nationalists. And so you couldn't do any better than having a French Canadian themselves being skeptical about special status, let alone separatism. And then he was there, as Prime Minister of Canada, living, breathing proof that French Canadians maybe weren't just an exploited ethnic proletariat, but they could have and had in the past power in the Canadian political culture. Next slide, please. And so this is famous. And theorists of nationalism talk about simultaneous shared experiences as being essential to a sense of collective identity. And so those celebrations in 67 that I talked about and Trudeau-mania in 68 represented that. They don't necessarily have to be good experiences. So, everybody collectively, again, if you were in favor of Canada, if you're in favor of United Canada, freaked out when the PQ was elected it was 76, right? And then, that made Trudeau all the more relevant. And on top of that, there was another national drama going on, which was the Trudeau family. Like, how long had it been since you had a happy sitcom transpiring on in the nation's capital? So you had, the kind of divine sanction of having two of the three sons born on Christmas Day. But of course, then soon afterwards, everything went south, right? We have some familiar shots. This time it was, Margaret who was getting the international attention, if not acclaim. And again, the experience was something that was shared by all Canadians. Maybe any shared experience is a good experience for a nationalist. But Canadians could take comfort that although, Margaret might be off with Mick Jagger somewhere, that Pierre was still hard at work with his briefing binders and loyal to, married to Canada, still loyal to Miss Canada. By the late 1970s, I'm sure you can all recall this, Trudeau's political stock was dwindling, and there was an election in which Joe Clark won a minority government. That was in 1979. And then I said earlier he was lucky. What transpired after that showed that, again, that he was lucky because the Conservatives lost a confidence vote in the House of Commons. Trudeau, who temporarily retired, or they didn't know it was temporary at the time, returned because there seemed to be nobody else to be leader, or there wasn't time to run a leadership contest. There was debate about that. But anyways, suddenly, another election with Pierre Trudeau as leader and another Liberal majority government. And that really gave him his chance to finish off this tale number one of being the father of modern Canada, because that's when he was able to, as you all know, patriate the Constitution and add on his Charter of Rights. And so that's the end of tale number one. Well, not quite. I guess there's Meech Lake, where he retires, wrapped in glory, and that's the father of modern Canada. But then he has to come out of retirement again when Brian Mulroney tries to one-up him by making a deal that'll bring Quebec into the Constitution. And I talked about that earlier in relation to giving up your firstborn to immersion, to French immersion. One thing I didn't mention, though, was that he had made a promise in the 1980 referendum. He was, again, the essential French-Canadian federalist to fight the 1980 referendum. But that promise was that a no to the referendum did not mean the status quo. So that set up a problem, because there was a lot of different interpretations of what he meant by that. A lot of Quebec politicians, nationalists, thought that he meant special status of some kind, but the last thing that they thought he meant was that there would be a deal that would not include Quebec. So that unfinished business was, one serious caveat about this tale number one. Okay, so we'll go on to tale number two. How are we doing for time? Oh, there's a clock back there, which seems to be accurate, right? Oh, I'll need the next slide, I guess. Oh, we've already gone through this. Next one, oh, the end. Okay, then the evil sorcerer. So the second tale of Père Pierre is the polar opposite of the first. In this account, he doesn't save the country, he doesn't found the modern Canada, he ruins it. He's the worst thing that could have happened to Canada, and he's a disaster from which Canada is still trying to recover. A polarizing figure. Polar pair. So, next slide, please, John. According to this interpretation, he's a wild-eyed, free-spending socialist, totally out of touch with the discipline of the balance sheet. And under his leadership, the annual budget deficit climbs, the national debt balloons, Canadian business falls into a malaise, jobs are lost, investment is discouraged. Another one of his sins was that he didn't particularly like businessmen that much, and he didn't like hanging out with them, except for a couple of them, like Campo. And he didn't really like giving them privileged access to power. And they concluded that anyone who would freeze them out like that must be a socialist. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy was growing rapidly, I think, contributing to deficits. Between 70 and 75, I think the bureaucracy increased by over 35%, and the senior management ranks of bureaucracy went up over 100%. So there were, there was statistical proof for this kind of interpretation. And then in international affairs, if you can have another slide, He seemed to turn his back on tradition and forswear old alliances. Didn't seem to really want to cozy up to whoever was in the Oval Office. He thought Canada should reevaluate its diplomacy and take its national self-interest into account. And for many people, this threw into jeopardy, collective security, multilateral diplomacy, and again, the economy through those pre-existing trade relationships. He wasn't terribly consistent on this, but because I'm saying he's not terribly consistent because he seems to at times take an altruistic interest in increasing foreign aid, and then later in his career he'll go on his peace campaign. So cozying up to communist dictators is another part of this interpretation. And, according to tale number 2, his pursuit of the Constitution and accommodating Quebec and having a new Constitution was not, as one of his biographers said, a magnificent obsession, but it was really a kind of a perversion where it got people in Canada overexposed to deadly dull things like amending formulas and what else? Opting out formulas that made their eyes glaze over for decades, and just led to a lot of wrangling and not much edification in Canadian politics. And of course, this constitutional obsession, all in the name of national unity, came at a price in national unity, which was, losing the West. I think there's another slide, please. Westerners never really understood Central Canada's curious obsession with French-English relations, and after '68, Trudeau would never really elect more than a handful of MPs west of Ontario. The in the more disgruntled interpretations, it was all about French power in Ottawa, and that interpretation would say, oh well, one province shouldn't be running the whole country like this, and shouldn't be able to get so much power just by threatening to leave. And you should call their bluff. But instead, Trudeau was there, and all of his all of his closest aides were French. And next slide, please. Well, the interpretation of that previous slide would be that if it wasn't for Quebec voting for Trudeau all the time, if it was only real Canadians voting, the Liberals would never have won an election under Trudeau. And then there's the complaints about, the next slide, the Official Languages Act and bilingualism, French on cereal boxes, who can really stomach French at breakfast time. Multiculturalism was just a cynical ploy to win the ethnic vote, and a slap in the face to Canadians who'd been there for a long time. English Canadians had made Canada great, made it a desirable place for immigrants, and yet their values were now being treated the same as those foreigners who were just off the boat. It made no sense. Doesn't being here first count for something? Unless you're Indigenous. And then, some of Trudeau's conduct wasn't calculated to win him favor. Some of the less attractive aspects of Trudeau's personality often came to the fore. I mentioned his tough guy persona before. He wasn't always good at graciously entertaining criticism and diffusing confrontations. There's the famous Fuddle-Duddle incident, which was in 1971 in the House of Commons, when, in a rare attempt to communicate with, the common Canadian, in the common Canadian way, he used a very undiplomatic term, profane term, and then later claimed that it was, in fact, Fuddle-Duddle that he'd said. Which was a good way of diffusing it, because it was kind of comic. And then the Salmon Arm salute was another example, when his train, his private rail car, rolled by protesters in BC, and he gave them the finger, not once, but several times, just to be sure the message got across. And there are other examples of that sort of thing. So, of course, this fed criticisms that far from being a conscientious Liberal Democrat, he was an arrogant elitist, contemptuous of ordinary Canadians. Another part of tale number 2 is the cronyism that he indulged in and got away with with his friends like Pierre, who, what happened? He tried to get him a seat he was a civil servant, then he tried to get him a seat, and the constituency wouldn't elect him, so he got another civil service job, ended up being head of the CBC. Jim Coots, who was one of his private advisors, same sort of thing. He decided, I want to be a politician, and this is the type of thing that Jack Pickersgill had pulled off earlier. And Lester Pearson, too. But Canadians were having none of it at this point, and so Coots didn't make it. But there are other things like Arthur Erickson getting contracts for the embassy in Washington without due process, and without no competitive bidding process for his friend Campo with federal office buildings in Gatineau and that sort of thing. Things that if Stephen Harper had done, the press would have been all over him. But at the time, Trudeau just kept on doing it. When Trudeau retired, he indulged in this orgy of patronage appointments, which cost the Liberal Party dearly and hampered the candidacy of his successor. You all remember the television debate where Turner haplessly said, "I had no option." Well, that was about all the patronage appointments that that Trudeau had made when he had left office and saddled his successor with. So, the cronyism thing is really interesting, because the consensus is that after his defeat, or his near defeat in 72, and he just hung on by his fingertips with one riding, Trudeau was converted to being an electoral politician, and that after that he paid a lot more attention to the the less savory parts of politics. But, he seems to have gone overboard from one extreme to another in this case. Anyways, that's the end, pretty much the end of tale number 2. So essentially, progressives see him as a hero because he fused their politics with nation and symbolized the modernization of Canada, and conservatives see him as a villain because he betrayed the old Canada they associated with the nation, and they also see him as a kind of a corrupt, arrogant autocrat who undermined democracy. It's kind of interesting because they have problems. These two schools of thought have problems with the October crisis. Right? The tale number 2 people actually kind of admire Trudeau for what he did in the October crisis, and tale number 1 advocates are a bit embarrassed by his breach of civil liberties. So I didn't tell you it'd be all consistent. Now, there's a possible tale number 3, which exists out there. There's a couple of possibilities for tale number 3. Tale number 3 could be French-Canadian nationalists branding Trudeau a vendu, somebody who went to Ottawa to represent their interests and sold them out. It could also be, Social Democrats who see Trudeau as one of them who sold out for the benefits of power, left them in the lurch in the early 1960s, and although he seemed to have been a progressive, really wasn't. And I think the best explanation for that I've seen is that, in the 1950s, when you're combating Duplessis in Quebec, you can be fairly middle of the road as a Liberal Democrat and seem to be quite radical. But when you take those same values and put them, into Canada as a whole a decade later, at the height of the 60s, you're going to look relatively conservative. Anyways, those two possible tails number three aside, I've settled on a third approach, which is, here we are. Someone who's, a social scientist more than a humanist, and I like to use John A. Macdonald as an example. It's a kind of a foil to Trudeau in this case, the difference in their political styles. He's a bit too logical and arid in his thinking. He embraces liberalism and more as a dogma. And, he's a formidable debater who's out to win all the time, but maybe not out to achieve consensus and that kind of progress. So, what's the next slide, please? Famously, Joyce Wieland had this quilt made this quilt for him after or during the Trudeau mania phase. And the idea then was, it was so refreshing to hear somebody who was plain speaking and advocated rationalism in politics, because that seemed kind of idealistic at the time. But this was something that Trudeau actually took very seriously. And one of his biographers talks about that 68 to 72 period as being what they call the brief reign of rational government, where there was all this obsession about process and planning and how to systematize things in the government at the expense of delivering any content. And the expectations after Trudeau mania were really high, and so it was important to get something done, but not much seemed to get done. And that was part of the explanation for the brush with defeat in 72. You could go down a long list of cases where, an overly rational approach, an attempt to sort of, provide a wholesale systemic solution to problems didn't work out so well for Trudeau. I'm thinking of the White Paper on Indigenous State Relations in '69, wage and price controls, National Energy Program, the Charter. We can talk about the Charter some more later. He didn't really have a lot of interest or time for the human side of politics, for the deal making, for the brokerage of interests in different parts of the country, different interest groups in the country. You have the next slide, please. So, and another one, I'm just going to skip lightly across the Charter. So you can have all of these additions, just hit the next button, to another one, all these qualifications to the reason over passion slogan. So I think I've talked long enough, we've come to the end of tale number 3. And yes. That's a very insightful comment because I wrote that. And another slide, please. And the next. So, there's got to be a moral of all these stories. And
The last slide is too fast.
oh, okay. Can you go back one? So what I've suggested in tale number 3 is that, Pierre's not really comfortable with the art of politics. It's the story of a Liberal technocrat bumping up against the entrenched ambiguities of Canadian politics. And perhaps his major failing was his rigidity of mind and his inflexibility. John A. Macdonald is often criticized for his flexibility of methods and morals, yet Pierre might have used some of his knowledge of human nature and his ability to temporize and obfuscate. In cases where Pierre inspired widespread opposition with his schemes for wholesale systemic change, John A. might have covered the same ground with successive muffled baby steps, enabled by ego-massaging blandishments, enticements, and moved on. So, can you have the next slide, please, John? So the moral, if you click the button for tale number 3, is consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. The moral for tale number 2, well, I think it's his lack of, I want to remark mostly about his lack of empathy for others. People admired him, but I'm not sure that they loved him like they loved MacDonald and Laurier. So, to put it really bluntly, I mean, maybe he was successful as a prime minister, but a failure as a human being. It suggests that he may have been a Liberal Democrat as a political theorist, but in terms of temperament, not so much. So there we are. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. Everybody attributes that to Yogi Berra, but he gets all the good quotations that are anonymous. Tale number 1. If you were a Canadian nationalist or even just believe that United Canada isn't such a bad thing, then I think he was the essential prime minister, the one who kept Canada whole and moved it forward as a modern liberal democracy. Or at least that's what Richard Gwynne thinks. So, next slide, please. I'll leave it up to you. And then one more slide. So we've come to the questions portion of the program. Thank you.
We'll just ask people to come to the mic if you have a question.
It was such a comprehensive treatment, there's nothing left to be said, evidently.
You sort of stacked the deck, I think, in story number 1, all kinds of things that we all remember and admire. I thought you shortchanged story number 2 because you left out the NEP. But then you slipped NEP into story number 3. I think that his economic policy may be one of the fundamental principles of why some people say to follow story number 2. Can you comment more about the National Energy Program?
Yeah. Not my area of expertise, but the economic problems that, when he's accused of bad economic management, well, you remember what was happening during the 1970s? You had the OPEC crisis and then stagflation, and all Western economies were staggering under these blows. And, so there's a relativistic context to use there. And, if you look at that chart that I put up, he's not doing too badly compared to what happened subsequently in terms of the debt, the national debt. What can you do with Alberta in times where it's finally getting rich on its resources? One of the things that isn't mentioned often is that Canada was subsidizing Alberta oil in, the 40s and 50s, and it's only, in the 70s that they suddenly strike rich, and it becomes such a regional grievance that there would be any kind of federal interference with their windfall profits. I don't think that in the 70s the Liberals did a very good job negotiating with Alberta. I don't think they got, I don't think they made their case very well, and I don't think that maybe it was an impossible situation. I I would argue that packaging it as a national energy program might have been a way just to, inflame Western regionalism, because to them it would just mean like a central Canadian program for the benefit of central Canada. And famously, the one development that was not taken into consideration with the national energy program was the possibility of oil prices dropping. And when they did, it just fell apart. So, the famous bumper sticker of let those eastern bastards freeze in the dark. What can you do with that kind of political sentiment in a particular region? I don't know. I think you just have to, work the diplomatic arts consistently over a long period of time to get around it. But as I had suggested during my talk, it's all exacerbated by the fact that the West feels that there's this odd obsession in central Canada with the Constitution. Any other aspects of it that I haven't touched on?
That's pretty good, but I also, the whole notion of moving oil exploration off of provincial lands and onto the federal lands in the north, and in many ways this was visionary.
Yeah.
But probably 20 years, 30 years ahead of when it was reasonable or it could be done. And I think it does. Perhaps you're right in tying this into story number 3, which is the technocrat. The reports came out of Energy, Mines and Resources. Trudeau liked it. They put it in place. It was not based upon things that the energy industry as it actually worked. The fact that oil rigs started moving across the border the next day. We've all lived through.
Well, what are the possibilities really of making a bunch of Texas oil men happy with the national policy, right? The national energy policy? So.
Yeah, I don't think it was good. Again, it was a technocratic solution. I think your analysis your comparison with Sir John A. Macdonald, I think, is very good. We had an excellent presentation on Macdonald earlier, in which this pragmatism and this humanity, this willingness to bend rules or to do things on the sly, contrasts so starkly with these technocratic solutions. And but I think in doing the presentation to leave NEP out of story number 2 is
and it's happening at the same time as the final chapter in the constitutional saga too, right? So that feeling in the West that Central Canada is obsessed with the French-English issue, and
it all ties in.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for the presentation.
Oh, thank you for your question. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could comment on Trudeau's attitude and policy towards the United States and how that fits into these 3 tales that you have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was very. I have some colleagues in the crowd here talk about international affairs. Trudeau's policy is much more, in a much more informed way than I can. But people are unhappy with it. Let me restart. At first, it's his attitude towards the United States is it's a problem because he seems to be too close to the United States. During the 1968 election campaign, he's not really criticizing the Vietnam War. And people are urging him to do that because that's kind of a key identity marker for Canadians, hypocritically at the time, that they are not involved in napalming these Southeast Asian peasants on the other side of the world, and therefore they're superior to the United States. So Canadians actually kind of define their national identity in the 1960s in conformity with the counterculture in a way and the anti-war movement in the United States. They see themselves as a kinder, gentler America, the type of North American liberal democracy that should be that would be the ideal in the climate of the 1960s. So Trudeau, I mean, in an odd way, at first, is not on side with that kind of, crypto anti-Americanism in Canadian nationalism in the late 1960s. But then he decides that he's going to, have a more independent foreign policy, and so distance himself from Canada's traditional role as junior partner in the Cold War. That becomes a problem as well. That then he's throwing into jeopardy all of the special privileges that Canada has through its traditional special relationship with the United States. And there's also the kind of personality clashes that exist between him and, for instance, Nixon, especially early on. And the fact that, the Americans elect Nixon in '68 and the Canadians elect Trudeau is a great source of pride for Canadians that, once again, they win all this international approval from having this leader who is, and they don't get along on a personal level either. So now I'm starting to wonder. I don't know what exactly, was there something else that I should be talking about that your question invoked that?
Well, I was wondering how much the third way impacted sort of the nationalism that you talked about in Tale 1.
Yeah, I think
the third option and so on.
Yeah, the third option. Boy, I just don't think it was, there was much to work with there. It's a good idea. You always want to find ways to offset the preponderant American power and dependence on the United States as a trading partner. It's actually, more, it's only nowadays that it looks like, might be a possibility. 50 years later.
Thank you very much.
Just a quick one. Did Laurier and Mackenzie King have Westerners thinking the federal government was paying too much attention to Quebec in the midst of two terrible wars that could have torn the country apart?
That's a lot of history to think about. I'm not so sure that it was so much a regional thing then as it was more of a ethnocultural thing of, British British loyalty of Anglo-Canadians against perceived French disloyalty. Sorry, you were the one that asked the question, right? Yeah. And so I don't see that being broken down so much on a regional level. And in fact, out west at the time, there were a lot of recent immigrants in the First World War who were considered to be suspect because they, were from where? The Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so they were heavily policed or interned. So I don't think it plays out the same way in that period. Yeah.
Two-part question relative to multiculturalism. Has Pierre's concept of multiculturalism evolved over the last 40 years? And if so, what criteria do we have today to evaluate whether it has been or will be successful going forward?
Just a bit more background on that. It's really interesting in the 1960s, like even early on, you can see that Canadian intellectuals who are concerned about the Quebec problem are starting to push this idea of unity and diversity as opposed to having an Anglophilic or British-based nationalism. And Canadians as a whole aren't ready for it. You can see that in the flag debate and other issues like that in the 60s, and you can see it in polls, where English Canadians as a whole aren't ready for it. So, it's considered to be controversial in '71. Nowadays, I think that most Canadians see it as a key identity marker that they take pride in. And so, it's interesting to see how long it takes the intellectual elites to get their redefinition of national identity popularized. And I would say it's like a 20 or 30-year period between the early 60s until it starts to be generally embraced as a Canadian virtue. And of course, the other change is that with the restrictions on, or the discrimination in the immigration rules finally being stripped away in the late 1960s, there's a new demographic reality to multiculturalism that's increasing by leaps and bounds into the present day, where it is a demographic reality on the ground, or you can be in many workplaces. Families people who come from families who've been in Canada and are, of British origin, or even just Western European, can find themselves in a distinct minority now. Didn't they just say that in Toronto, whites are now a minority? And so there's that definite change that's taken place as well. And so I think that, that's one of Trudeau's prescriptions that has come true, that Canada has taken great pride now. It's not perfect, obviously, but it functions somewhat better than in other other countries in the world, which probably spring to mind pretty readily. The problem is, I think, that it's become pretty much like an urban reality, and rural Canada is just not participating in it the same way for obvious economic reasons. That's not where immigrants want to go. So there's a real kind of rural-urban split there, where the reality in urban centers, the big urban centers, is multiculturalism, and people who live in rural Canada just don't see it. Does that answer your question?
I'll just yell if we need to. How do you think the current Prime Minister is affected by Daddy? Like, was he a good boy and does what Daddy says? Or what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I try not to read the papers and follow these things because they're always so dispiriting. Well, first of all, he's affected by it in the sense that he wouldn't be Prime Minister unless Pierre was his father. One of the things that I noticed when he was elected, was it the evening of the election victory, that he said Canada is back? And I think what he was saying was, Harper tried to change Canada fundamentally, and now, it's my dad's Canada has come back. One of the interesting things about Trudeau is, he gets all this criticism about his economic management, and he also gets criticized for, betraying his social democratic tendencies from earlier in his career. But the economy that was being, rocked by all of the OPEC crisis and stagflation in the 1970s. This was an economy that, for the federal government, it was trying to digest all the new expenditures associated with Medicare and other social programs, and nobody really knew, how that was going to work out. And so there's a lot of criticism from the emerging neoliberal ideologues that kind of expenditure is what's causing the economy to stagnate. So from, a left perspective, Trudeau has to be given credit for not slashing and burning to get rid of social programs to balance. Oh, I'm back. In the 1970s, in particular, maybe, the 70s were still kind of an experimental time of working through how budgeting for social programs and the full, or the welfare state to the extent it had been developed in the 60s would work out. But pretty quickly, you get Thatcher in 79 and Reagan. When does Reagan get elected? 80. So there are examples elsewhere in the Anglosphere, and the two nations that probably have most impact on Canada, of very different policies being introduced and the budget cuts, program cuts coming, and Trudeau doesn't go there, and Canadians generally don't go there for another. That neoliberal discourse is circulating throughout the 70s, 80s, and it's not until the Paul Martin budget in '93 that finally there's some kind of serious discipline applied. So again, I'm wandering. I don't know, have I answered your question at this point? Okay.
Staying with economics and the debt,
Mm-hmm.
how in the 70s did Canada's debt deficit ratio stack up to the other, what we now call the G7, like the States, Germany, Italy, France? Was it better? Was it worse? Was it about the same as anywhere?
I don't know. Sorry. But it wasn't bad. I mean, it wasn't outrageously bad. I think it was kind of middle of the road. And I'd have to actually, have done my homework better to be able to answer that question. Does anybody know? Anybody here know? I guess that's all I can say, really. I shouldn't just sort of make stuff up. But if it had been outrageously bad or outrageously good, I would have noted that at some point. And I think it was just sort of middle of the road.